Well, welcome. I'm in Prague and I'm delighted to welcome a very distinguished guest, Professor Chris Bickerton from the University of Cambridge. Professor Bickerton is just working on a book about the history of Europe since 1989. And I want to talk to you about one aspect that you cover in the book, and that is how Europe is changing, partly or even more intensely in response to the Russian full-blown invasion of Ukraine in February last year, 2022. So people talk about Europe's geopolitical moment. What do you make of that concept?
So people started talking about Europe and geopolitics together, and the European Union specifically in geopolitics for a while, but I've definitely noticed that since the Russian invasion of 2022, which was for many people who were observing came as a surprise, as a shock, and that's also the case for many people within European institutions, you started to have a growing sense that the EU needs to, in its approach to many things, think in a more geopolitical way. What that means exactly, what they think that mean when they say that, I think is that there's a greater attention to European interests, to the definition of European interests, a willingness to act in accordance with those interests rather than in line with certain broad values that the European Union also subscribes to. So making difficult trade-offs, being more pragmatic in that sense. What struck me most of all about the way this geopolitical moment has been talked about is that it seems to me that it's been talked about in the way that we've been talking about Europe and its role in the world and Europe in global affairs and the EU and its foreign policy. It's the same that we've been saying for now 2 to 3 decades. Ever since in the late 1990s, the European Union committed itself to a security and defence policy, which was prompted partly by by NATO's intervention in Kosovo. It was partly a delayed effect of the Yugoslav wars of the early 1990s. It was partly a reflection of the ambitions of Tony Blair and Jacques Chirac at the time. But for all of these different reasons, we started to have this security and defence policy put in place and discussions about Europe having troops, having missions abroad, this kind of language. But what we say when we talk about Europe's geopolitical moment today, we always say Europe should think in this way, it should think in that way. Europe is at a crossroads and it must finally step into the world of power politics. And to be honest, exactly the same things have been said 10 years ago, 20 years ago, ever since the EU started to think seriously about having a security and defence policy.
There is a lot of talk, but not quite the ability or the capability to live up to this talk.
Well, so exactly that description is exactly the same sort of description that we've been hearing for a long time, is that Europe talks the talk, but it doesn't walk the walk.
You talk about exhortative mode of geopolitics rather than actions, right?
Yes, though I think in our discussions you've also used the term performative, which I think is maybe better, which is there's a call for action, a call to arms, language which is really emphasizing it's as if the European Union could become a security actor if it wants to enough, as if it's a question of will. And I think in many respects it's not just about whether you want something. There are many things I want that I can't get. So you can't reduce things just to will.
And why can't the EU become a major geopolitical actor?
So that's a really good question to which I'm not sure I have a particularly polished answer. My feeling is that over a long period of time, and this takes us to before the 1990s, and I think this is actually a product of quite a long process after the settlement of the Second World War, a number of European societies that are key states within the European Union basically were transformed, and this is not my phrase, from warfare to welfare states.
Yes, yeah.
Quite a profound, steady process of demilitarization of society. And my view is that foreign policy ultimately reflects domestic policy. That's my view. Foreign policy ultimately reflects a certain structure of state-society relations. And I think European societies, and I think now in a quite an accelerated form, a lot of newer members of the European Union have been restructured as essentially demilitarized societies with no knowledge or interest or ability to wage war. And changing that quickly is very difficult.
But it is changing quite dramatically, right? There is a lively debate in Germany about the lack of strategic culture. Poland has the ambition to build the biggest, the strongest army within Europe. One question that I see it relates to is about the EU's constraints. Brings me back to a topic you researched extensively 10, 20 years ago, and that is the question of sovereignty. Right? The EU, for some people, is a state in the making, for others not. But to the extent that the EU is not a sovereign political entity in its own right, it is then still within the power of member states to act as credible military actors, and member states through NATO, right, to act as credible military actors. So is that one of the sources of very real constraints as to how geopolitical Europe can be?
Yeah, so there are definitely some real institutional constraints, I think. Whether or not the European Union can function as some sort of sovereign entity is an obvious constraint. It sits alongside what I think is maybe the principal constraint, is that there is an alternative vehicle through which any sort of remilitarization should take place, and that is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Yes. So in the absence of NATO, you can imagine that there would be a lot of pressure to work through EU institutions towards having some sort of military apparatus. Yes. The fact that there is another place where this should happen means that even if you wanted to do it through the EU, you have to fight enormous resistance for many EU member states and many other powers around the world.
Poland would be...
Poland would be absolutely against some idea that we can ditch NATO and do it. So the fact that NATO exists means that these things tend to happen through there. So if there is some sort of remilitarization as you describe, and I think on that, I'm not saying nothing's happened, but I'm definitely skeptical about how quickly these changes can take place.
Because the change is needed also in people's heads, basically. It's a cultural change, right? That military is needed, it's not just to spend money, but also to have people who will be willing to die for their countries, ultimately.
And to have people who support those who do.
Yes.
But there is also, I think, though, a question of scale. I think looking at the figures in terms of what Germany's committed to defence spending, from what I've seen in the community of people who study this very closely, there's quite a lot of scepticism that the amounts of money allocated, for a start, they are fixed in time. Secondly, it looks like they may not be enough even to bring the Bundeswehr up to some sort of operational standard, let alone develop it further.